Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome to my realism and practicality review of the city Markarth from the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Now, a couple of, things to get out of the way to kick us off. As always, very common with all my reviews of the Skyrim cities, not big enough to be a city, but small enough to be a castle. It would be on the bigger side of castle, and it's got some really good elements to its layout, design, and location, with a bit of a caveat that I will explain as I get into it. If you ever design a castle or are wanting to design a castle, the first thing you need to look at and consider is location. When it comes to castles, the term location really does apply, because it's in the location that you will grant your castle its most primary and kind of effective defensive features. In fact, by virtue of the location, you can make a castle nearly impregnable and not have many fortifications on the structure itself, and it's just fortified and impregnable just because of its position. So location is profoundly important, and that is the first thing I always consider when I'm looking and reviewing fantasy castle designs. And here we get to see Markarth's location. And it's interesting, you see it nestled right in kind of like the armpit, you could say, of this big mountain, right at the foot of the base of it, and right in the middle, surrounded on either side. I'm a bit divided because this feature seems to be done a lot. People love to put castles at the bottom of mountains and hills, when in reality, you want to do the exact opposite. Don't put them at the bottom of the hill. You want to put them at the top of the hill. I mean, putting it at the top of these big mountains here would make it so much more, defensible. But this is supposed to be a city, and one of the issues with a city, one of the things that you want to have with them, is to have them accessible. Indeed, cities that tend to grow and just flourish are cities that are positioned in easily accessible locations. Indeed, those cities that are positioned at the center points of trades, like at intersections of common trade routes or, roads that you travel along and stuff like that. Cities and just villages, and perhaps villages that grow into cities, tend to just sprout and grow naturally in those locations, and putting a city on the top of a mountain can be kind of counterproductive to that purpose, to the point where it probably wouldn't have even grown into a city. And so for that purpose, I can kind of see, well, Markarth probably not the best to be at the top of one of these mountains, but it's not big enough to be a city, that's the thing. And if it's just trying to fulfill the purpose of a fortress, a castle, right, you wouldn't want to put it where Markarth is currently shown to be. You would put it at the top of one of those mountains. But because it's considered a city, you need to take these other facts into consideration. So then, looking at its actual position and not wishing it to be in any place else, are there benefits and detriments to its position? Well, yes, there is. The first, this always comes to my mind when I see a castle or city or any fortified structure at the base of a large hill. And it's that I worry for its safety in regards to avalanches, rock falls, and stuff like that. Doesn't strike me as being too safe. Now, of course, this has been done before, but it wasn't common, alright? When it comes to actual fortified structural defenses for, medieval or anything like that, putting them at the bottom of the hills certainly are the exceptions. You want to put them on the top of the hills. And in fact, oh gosh, I gotta mention some of the most beautiful castles I've ever seen that I've found in like the last, I think I found these 3 or 4 months ago in my personal study of castles. They are called the Five Sons of Carcassonne. They're a set of castles that were built along an old French border, and look at their positions, like in terms of, location, these castles just blow my mind. They're some of the best examples of castles that were built to fulfill this mentality. They are put just on the top of these glorious hills, absolutely impregnable by virtue of their location. They are just amazing. Go look them up. They're called the Five Sons of Carcassonne, also called Carther Castles. Just stunning. So there you go. Castles on top of hills, baby. That's amazing. But, like I said, there are examples of castles on the bottom of hills or built into the side of hills. The best one that I can think of, and I've referenced it before in my videos, is Prejama Castle. And I think I'm pronouncing it right this time. I've pronounced it Prejama, and I've been told, no, it's Prejama Castle. But look at that, right into, the side of the mountain. And one of my subscribers actually sent me photos of this castle. They visited it, and take a look at these matriculations! Oh, they're beautiful. And of course, I gotta do my war cry. I think I'm sorry for blasting out your headphones, but I can't not do it. It's like my favorite word. Another castle built kind of at the base of a mountain, but certainly on the side of a mountain, is Marmel's Castle in Germany. And just have a look at this one. What a beautiful example. In fact, it's so small next to the mountain, it almost looks like it's a little model placed next to a rock. Just beautiful. Alright, back to Markarth. So, yes, issues with it being on the bottom of a hill. But at the same time, these hills provide a very strong natural defense. If you were to discount, the rockfall, avalanche, issues. And the natural defense is that basically has impregnable walls on 3 of its back ends, to the point where it only needs to fortify one side, and that's the front entrance. This is very, very effective in terms of military defense. I mean, yeah, and an enemy cannot assail it, and it's interesting. Could they get up to the top of these mountains? Like, gee, that's a hard climb. I'm not sure an army would want to try and, climb these mountains, but if they're really energetic, maybe they could, and then could they engineer a rockfall? Perhaps, but maybe these mountains just absolutely unassailable. You can't climb up to the top of them, and if you couldn't, then they couldn't be exploited by enemies, and you just have to worry about the natural disasters that could occur, through avalanches and stuff. But in terms of, an assault, no, I'm not sure the enemy could actually use these 3, mountains to their benefit, which means they can only attack from one location, one direction, and that's exactly what you want. Like, the next thing for a castle, outside of location, is you want to engineer your enemies to have a single approach to your castle, so you can predict. And if you know that there's only one way to approach your fortress, fortification, castle, whatever, you fortify that approach massively. And Markarth has this. You can only get to this city castle, right? And I'm just going to call it a castle, right? From one direction, and that's the front. So, massive points there in regards to its defensive value. Now, have they fortified this approach as much as possible? Not really. At least they do have a pretty heavy fortification. In fact, one of the better fortifications I've seen with Skyrim, this is a proper gatehouse. Well, it looks like a proper gatehouse. It's not a really proper gatehouse, and I'll explain why it's not proper. And some of my viewers are catching on. I like that word, proper. But I'll get to that, in a second. First, I want to talk about what they could have done to improve this approach. Because look at this approach. All right, there's only one way, and do you see right here? There's like a natural bailey formed by the mountain itself. This section here is like an outer bailey purely formed by these mountains on either side. This is amazing. If you had a real castle here, that would be good. In fact, right here could be the location of a great castle, because it's a lot safer from rockfalls. These mountains are a lot smaller, and if you put the keep smack bang right in the middle, where we're looking at right here, perfect location for a castle, because being in the middle, it is far enough away from the edges, from rockfalls and avalanches. The mountains aren't big enough, so you can have a castle right there, and then see this gap right here in between these two mountains? Perfect position for another wall and another gatehouse. And when I say perfect, I mean perfect. And these side mountains are really tall. Like, look at them, okay? So in terms of utilizing its location to the best level it can, Markarth is really missing out for not having a secondary wall right here. I mean, it's perfect right here. And not only there, you could have another wall coming from this rock formation here and going here again. And so, layers of defense. Next principle for effective castle design, alright? Layers of defense. You fortify the main, approach as much as possible, and you have redundancies. When the enemy can break through the first outer defense, you have a backup, and another backup, and another backup. And it's hard to say, can you have too many? Because, having as much defense as possible is very, very good for castle-like defenses. But at the same time, there is a level of practicality, because there is a sense that I have noticed on real historical castles where enough is enough. If you have enough defenses to the point where your castle is already pretty much, impregnable, you probably don't need any more. And that has been done on historical castles, where they get to a certain level of effectiveness and they're like, yep, this is perfectly enough. We don't need to do any more, even when they could have put on more defenses. And the question is, does Markarth need more defenses than what it has? And I would say, yes, or at least one more outer wall, because as soon as, the attackers bust through this wall right here, they're into the castle proper, and the defenders are stuffed. So, yes, I think it needs another wall, and it's missing out on it, so sorry, Markarth, no. Okay, now let's look at the actual wall that is here, and this supposed maybe gatehouse. Look, it is a gatehouse, but it's falling short as a gatehouse. Why is it falling short? Well, let me explain. It has a great opportunity to have a drawbridge. See how it's on an elevated position? This is brilliant. Having an elevated position for the entrance is great. And, castles have been utilizing that feature to the point where sometimes they actually engineer an elevated position outside of just being, if they were elevated by the virtue of where its location, its position, that's great. Sometimes it's on a flat area and they build it up high anyway, so they can put a drawbridge on it. And see these stairs here? You could put the stairs down here and have a drawbridge spanning the distance, which just grants greater defenses, but they don't have it. So there's the first missed opportunity. The next missed opportunity, it has almost like flanking towers here. See, there's a guy standing there. There's a guy standing there. And there's a blatant flaw right here that I'll point out in a second. But can you pick out what that is? All right, see if you can figure out what the flaw is, what we're looking at right here. But first, I won't address that one, that, what you could see. But in terms of these side, parts, they're like towers, okay? But they're sitting in line with the actual gatehouse. They're not protruding outwards. And one of the main features that you will see on real historical gatehouses is that these towers protrude outwards to give the defenders who are standing on the walls a greater field of fire. More specifically, when the enemy comes in to try and bash down the door, right, the gate that should be here, so the enemy would be standing right here, the defenders on the wall need a field of fire to shoot at them. Now, we do see an arrow loop, a single arrow loop, which is, at least it's not nothing, but on real historical gatehouses, there would be a full tower extending right here, giving more than just one defender, heaps of defenders, a massive field of fire, so they can shoot right down on the attackers trying to, barrage down the door. So, this is a flaw in its design. And now to the thing that's just really odd that I was asking if you could notice. There's no actual, crenellations on these battlements. You would call this a battlement, but it's not a crenellated battlement. What are crenellations? Well, if you know my, content at all, merlons and crenelles, okay? The crenellated tops of castle walls that you see that give the defenders on top of the walls cover from offensive or attacking arrow fire. There's like these little kind of knob things, but they're just there for aesthetics. They're not granting any real defenses at all. So where's the crenellations, guys? Next big problem, there's no actual gate on the outermost part of the gatehouse. You have this opening here to a gatehouse, like this is a gate right here, but there should be another one on the outermost part, because if they did, it's funny, the inside part of this gatehouse, there's almost such a beautiful win, but a huge fail as well. What's the win? Well, we go in, and what do we see above us? A murder hole! A murder hole that doesn't have any access. I was about to go ballistic. They have a real murder hole. Wait. Is there a door? Yes, there's a door to the murder hole, which means it's a proper murder hole. I got it! Hallelujah! Yes! So, effectively, what this should be functioning like is when the enemy, if there was a door, a gate, and hopefully with a portcullis, even though there isn't much room for the portcullis to be raised into above, but there should be a portcullis and door right here, which prevents the enemy breaking in. And once they break in, they enter this death zone, and they would just get rained down with death from the murder hole above. But there's an odd thing here, and we see it to our left, and we see it to our right. Doors, which are providing access to the defensive parts of the castle. We go up, look! This is where the defenders would be, alright? The arrow loops and everything like that. And going up the stairs again, this is where the defender is standing, right there. And you're giving free access to the enemy when they break through the first one. In fact, there's no door here at all. There's no door in here, so all the enemy has to do when they're attacking is waltz right up these stairs. Heaven help any defenders standing right here trying to defend it, because they're not protected. They're not utilizing the actual, fortifications that should be here. And the defender just waltz right up. There's no gate here, so they walk right through. Then they can just walk right up into the gatehouse itself. This is like having an open door to a castle, inviting your, attackers to invade. This type of design, in terms of actual effective fortifications, is completely inbred, like absolutely ridiculous, okay? I will give it points for having actual effective arrow loops. Like these are arrow loops, so the defenders, they can shoot through at anyone attacking if they couldn't, be snuck up from behind and just hit in the back by anyone walking through. But say that if there were gates there, right? And the stairs, open doors to the central part where the enemy would get trapped, no stairs leading up. They could stand here, fire down, duck behind, cover, lean out, fire. Like, this is what a proper arrow loop is. Now, in terms of how defensible they are, well, they give people protection from arrow fire, but they wouldn't give much protection from actual bombardment, from siege equipment, because these walls aren't thick enough. Now, you might say, well, hang on, arrow loops aren't really that thick anyway, aren't they? People have to get close enough to shoot through them. And yes, that's correct to an extent, but there's this ingenious way in which arrow loops were incorporated on real castles. And that is that there is like a crevice or an alcove built into the wall. The walls are at least a meter, usually 2 meters thick, right? And then an alcove is carved out, providing an inlet and a walk up to where the actual arrow loop is. It's a beautiful bit of architecture and engineering. And so here you don't have that. In fact, you have arrow loops stacked so closely side by side that the wall needs to be, like, look how thick this is. It's 20-30 centimeters thick, okay? And this would not stand up against a bombardment from, any heavily sized siege equipment. And it's funny because there were some really big trebuchets and stuff made. They weren't common, but the biggest one, Warwolf, wasn't the most common. Not all trebuchets were that big, but Warwolf was the biggest, right? And that could take out castle walls after a lot of effort, okay, a lot of bombardment. And the smaller ones, like the smaller siege equipments and stuff, good luck actually getting through properly, thick castle walls. It's not going to happen. That is why castle walls were made so thick and so strong to hold off against potential bombardment, and we don't see that on the gatehouse here in Markarth. So, guys, come on. Markarth does have these two kind of outer tower thingies, okay? Hard pressed for me to call them towers because they're not very tall, right? And there is a guard standing in each one, but it's suffering from a major, problem. And there's no crenellations for these guardsmen to hide behind and defend. It's right out in the open, yet they might be able to duck behind the pillars on the side. But this is not a properly defended, tower or fortified tower at all. And so, no, it's not working. Not much point for them being there, in my opinion. And now let's look at this side wall here. There is an interesting element to it that I discovered inadvertently, and that is there's kind of a sally port in this area as where? Well, it's through the water part. Now, it's true, I kind of like this feature because castles did have back entrances. So when they were being besieged, they could sneak in supplies, troops and stuff like that, and they were called sally ports, and they were kind of back doors. And if you go in underneath here, you'll see that there's actually a stairwell hidden away. It'll be pretty difficult to get to, working against the current in the water, but walking through here, this actually is access to the upper part. There should be a grate, a really big, metal grate blocking off, access here with a nice big lock on it. But if it was there, this would be a functional and pretty, historically authentic sally port, which is a side entrance, backdoor entrance into the castle proper. So I actually like that feature. I don't call it, well, it's funny. I was about to say I don't call it a weakness in its defenses. If it had, a proper grate, blocking off access. But they don't have it there, so because it's another open door, it's actually a big weakness as well if people knew where it was. So that's the first kind of thing to say about this side wall. The next part is that there's no access to it, okay? And if there's no access to it, this actually isn't a battlement anymore. It's just a wall, okay? There's no stairs on the back end leading up to it, no door leading out to it. So it's just a wall, it's not a battlement, and there's no crenellations on it either. Like these little, square knobs up the top, they're not real Merlons. They don't provide full cover for anyone, and why would they need to? Because no one can even get up there, so a very pointless, well, not pointless because it blocks people from getting into, but it's not utilized to its full level at all. So that's Markarth's outer kind of wall, its outer defenses. Now let's take a look at its layout, and I find its layout actually quite intriguing. There's a lot of ramps, okay, and walkways all around Markarth leading to different elevations, different positions. And in fact, if you ever go in and play Skyrim for the first time and walk around Markarth, you'll probably get lost, alright? You'll get, well, not lost, but turned around and walking into kind of dead-end-ish areas. I know I did. Maybe that's because I'm just stupid, but I actually find that a good defensive feature, and for the residents, you might say it's inconvenient, but no, because if you live here long enough, you'll learn which paths lead to what areas, but for an attacker who's not familiar with it, confusing the attackers, leading them down different paths and them getting confused and going to a different location to where they want to get to is a very good defensive feature, so I like that, okay? Points right there. The next thing about this layout is that you'll notice that it has this central kind of mound area, and where it is, there's the temple, I think it's the Temple of Debilla or something, and there's this tower, and in fact the tower is called the Guard Tower or something like that. And that's really good, and it's on an elevated position. It's funny, in fact, this central position here is a perfect position for a keep. Yeah, and in fact, they kind of have a keep-ish, which is a tower. And interesting, the keeps of castles were often simply called the Great Tower, and that's kind of where the term donjon comes from, because the term donjon means Great Tower, and so much confusion into the synonymous nature between the donjon and the keep, because they were very synonymous, but because donjon actually means Great Tower, in English it's come to mean literally that, the Great Tower, and if the main actual body of the castle was an actual structure, that would be called the keep, and if there was a larger tower separate to the keep, that would actually be called the donjon now in English, because it means Great Tower, separate to the keep, when originally they meant the same thing, and the keep would be the donjon, but there you go. And so I could actually call this fortified tower here the donjon, or the actual keep, because it's funny. I couldn't call it the keep in English, because keep now means the main habitable fortified structure, and this is more of a defensive tower, and we know, the palace is behind us right here, built into the side of the cliff. And so that would kind of be called the keep, like according to what buildings were function, or this, the actual temple would be called the keep. And it's interesting, if just looking at the temple here, there does seem to be a part of its design that is fortified. And what part is it fortified? It is these towers here, or the pillars, not towers, these side pillars of the temple. These pillars can actually function as legitimate merlons, okay, for the defenders to gain cover from it, attackers from underneath. And they can stand on this rampart here and fire down on any enemies getting confused by all the walkways. And there's, a rampart on either side of this kind of keep/temple. And so it kind of has crenellations there, and they would be functional enough. And there's a lot of walkways underneath them to fire down on, so I could almost call that semi-fortified. And also getting access to this area is difficult. They just put a gate right here, because to get access you need to go through this walkway here, put a gate on it, right? Maybe a murder hole up above or something like that, and you essentially have kind of like a gatehouse blocking off access to this keep/temple. So this isn't bad. That's actually, it's functional enough. It works. I'll give it points there. And I could call this building the keep, and I would call this, tower the donjon. And let's have a look at this tower now. What we see, it looks to be like it has arrow loops on it. But when we go inside, we see there's no access to the arrow loops at all. In fact, this whole tower is hollow. There's no, walkways access all the way up. In fact, it's suffering from the Doctor Who sickness that is very prevalent in many of the buildings in Skyrim. And it's that it's bigger on the inside. Wherefrom, if you have a look at the tower from the outside, it's actually rather small. Or you see the size of this man, the size of this tower, and you go inside, it's bigger on the inside!
Is it bigger?
Yes.
On the inside?
Look, we need to concentrate.
There it is!
Yep, I know where you're going with this, but I need you to calm down.
On the outside?
Oh, you certainly grasped the essentials.
My entire understanding of physical space has been transformed! Three-dimensional Euclidean geometry has been torn up, thrown in the air, and snubbed to death! My grasp of the universal constants of physical reality has been changed forever.
Doctor Who has certainly, had his way with many of the buildings in Skyrim. Had his way? Am I saying he's, violated the buildings? I don't know. Is that what happens when a Time Lord violates a building? Okay, this is getting way off track. The other unfortunate kind of thing with this tower is apart from confusing the enemy, the attackers, if they ever breach the outer wall, which is pretty easy considering the state of the outer gatehouse, they can just walk up the stairs. If they find their way, they walk up their stairs right to the front door of this tower. And remember how I was saying, one of the good elements of castle defense is utilizing the terrain to your best advantage. And if there's an opportunity to put a wall somewhere, like we saw on the outside of Markarth there, you should do it, because it just adds better defenses. And gee, there's so much opportunity to put walls and defenses. Like, look at this pathway right here in between the tower and the temple. See this, section right here? Just put a wall here. It doesn't even need to be too thick, because you're not going to get bombarded. This part of the wall isn't going to get bombarded, and its only threat is from people on foot because of this stairwell here. So it doesn't have to be massively thick, but made out of stone. There's stone things everywhere. Put a thick gate on it, maybe even a portcullis and stuff, and now you've blocked off people getting access to the tower. And if the tower actually had access to its arrow loops, this could be a massively effective defensive, structure within the castle itself. It is perfectly positioned to rain down death on all other sections of the, internal bailey or ward of this castle. It's on an elevated position, it's centralized, so if they could actually use it for defense, this could just destroy so many enemies that break through and get into the inner ward/bailey of this castle. But because there's no wall defending it, people can just walk right on up into it, and the arrow loops don't have access to on the inside. It's just there for looks. Right? It's serving no functional purpose at all. It breaks my heart because it has so much potential, yet it's lost. And then finally, we have the actual palace itself. And so there is kind of like an upper rampart we see here for defenders to stand up and fire down on anyone trying to assault the palace, but there's no crenellations there. So the defenders standing there will be pretty, vulnerable. That's the thing, like Skyrim seems to not like crenellations. One of the most identifying and important features of a castle. Skyrim doesn't have it. They do not like Merlons for some reason. And another reason why this is such a tragedy is that even within the medieval period itself, crenellations was considered one of the identifying features of a castle. Like a lot of the medieval people, first it needed to be functional. In the main medieval period, castle needed to be functional, be considered a castle, and part of that is that it needed to have functional crenellations. So much so, later on, when castles didn't need to be functional, people thought they just needed to have crenellations to be considered a castle, and crenellations became a kind of a prestigious element on castles, to the point where in certain parts in the medieval period, and not in every part in Europe either, this was only localized to certain, I think it was only maybe in Britain, that you needed a license to crenellate a building. So that's really interesting, a license to crenellate, and it was illegal to put crenellations on buildings, and one of the reasons, this could be used to regulate castle construction, so only people who you wanted to have a castle could have a castle, and you didn't want people who, the rebels or whatever, building castles, or people using castles against you. And the other thing is that only people of a certain prestigious, rank in society could have crenellations to reflect their position in society, and to the point where when nobility, like there's a case, I can't think of the specifics of the names and locations off the top of my head, but I certainly have read of one case where someone did something, there was a noble who did something illegal, okay, and his title was stripped, and in conjunction with his title being stripped, the crenellations on his adobe were torn down, ripped down, okay? You are not a noble anymore, so you do not have a right to have crenellations on your home. Isn't that interesting? So crenellations, very specific identifying feature of a building being looked at as a castle in the medieval period, and Skyrim just doesn't seem to like crenellations at all, doesn't understand them. The next element of the palace is that there is a perfect opportunity here to have another divided bailey. In fact, you see an archway right here. Just put a gate on it, okay? Chuck a gate here and chuck a wall here in between this section, and you've walled off one of the most, important parts of this castle, which is the palace, the place where the king is living. You want to protect the king, don't you? Well, the king would want to protect himself, even if his subjects might not want to. So put some walls here and protect where you're living, sir. But nope, there's nothing. And there we go. This has been my realism and practicality review of Markarth from the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Oh gee, this one was a fun one to have a look at. There was some really cool, unique elements to consider, and some fun, historical castles I was able to mention that I haven't been able to mention in my videos before, like the 5 Sons of Carcassonne. Awesome, so a lot of fun. It was a pleasure to make this, and thank you for watching, guys. I do hope you have enjoyed, and I hope to see you again. And until that time, farewell.